Welcome back to the Reptile Information Review. Today we're going to talk about testing reptiles for disease in the year 2021. The goal of this video is to show you how accessible testing for your reptiles is today. Specifically, the scope of this video will go over PCR tests. These tests are available at your local veterinarian, and in fact, you should ask a veterinarian to do these tests if you believe you have these diseases in your collection. But I also wanted to show you that you can do this right at home. Technology is ever changing, and in 2021, it's no different. PCR has become so accessible that there are companies now, like MiniPCR, you can check them out over at minipcr.com, that will offer you kits that you can use at home to detect specific types of DNA. That's exactly what PCR does. The polymerase chain reaction finds a piece of DNA inside of a biological sample, so let's say a piece of hair, a piece of snake shed, or a swab from the inside of someone's mouth. It takes that biological material and it looks for a very specific DNA sequence. If it's found, it goes through a special process where it's amplified. There are also techniques where certain tagging can be used so that it's easier to visualize this amplified DNA. Why do we want to amplify the DNA? To visualize it. We want to know that if there's even just a tiny amount of some specific DNA, whether that be bacteria or whether that be a virus, or even if that happens to just be a specific piece of animal DNA that we're looking for, we want to know that if that's present inside the sample, and the easiest way to do that is to use the PCR technique to amplify that to a point where we can actually visualize it. That's putting PCR very simply. There are some really amazing videos out there that will tell you exactly what PCR is, exactly what PCR does, videos demonstrating on how you can do PCR at home, and videos that demonstrate how this is used with human disease. There's a YouTube channel called The Thought Emporium that has a really great video both on PCR and also on how it's used in detecting disease in humans. PCR, again, can work with any type of DNA. It doesn't need to be specifically a virus. It doesn't need to be specifically a bacteria. It could be any chunk of DNA that you want to find inside of a sample. So it's a way to find that needle in a haystack, or in our case, that nito in a ball python. Really quickly, we want to go over a couple, there's sort of myths about PCR. So to begin with, PCR is very, very accurate. If that piece of DNA is present, it will amplify it. If that piece of DNA is not present, it obviously has nothing to amplify. When it comes to PCR testing, false negatives are more common than false positives. That's important to remember while you're managing your collection and also while you're managing individual animals. If you repeatedly get negatives, there's a good chance that the animal is negative. If you repeatedly get positives, it's not much different than if you only got one positive. So let me explain that a little bit more. If I take an animal and I test them and I get one negative and two positives out of 3 tests, that animal is positive. There's no question. I cannot stress enough how one test is never quite enough. Although I've said how accurate PCR should be, there are also other factors that are going to change the results of your test. Sample collection is the number one thing that affects the results of the test. Obviously, if you sample incorrectly, you're going to get a false negative on an animal that could be positive. If the animal isn't shedding the virus at the time that you swab, you will also fail to pick up any of the DNA required for the PCR process to be successful and give you a true result. This is true across. It doesn't matter if it's reptile diseases, bacteria, human diseases, whatever it is. The time that you sample and the number of times that you sample affect how true those results might be. You can look up different factors for the current pandemic that are going on where we're still using PCR testing to detect the presence of that specific virus. And sometimes you'll see numbers floating around like 10 to 20% that were false negatives or just not a true answer. Let's dig into that for just a moment. To be very, 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 very clear, this 10 to 20% number isn't something that is probably true for the current pandemic. It's probably not true for Nitovirus or rhinovirus or anything else. I just wanted to grab this number and use this in a thought experiment. If you do one test, that means 1 in 5 of your tests are probably going to be a false reading, and that reading is more than likely, because of the way that PCR works, going to be a false negative. That snake could very well still have the disease. If we were to repeat that test 3 times, using some very basic probability math, we would say that 20% to the power of 3 for 3 tests means that that probability drops down to 0.8% of having a false reading. That is absolutely minuscule and demonstrates exactly why testing multiple times is so important. To cover the reasons that we're even doing this, and trust me, Nitovirus testing is kind of frustrating and not fun, and it does cost money. The reasons that we're doing this is because of our investment in these animals. Now, if you heard me say investment and you assumed I meant money, that's not entirely what I mean. When I adopt an animal, when I bring this animal into my home, when I produce these animals are part of my family. I know that sounds sappy, but I really do love these animals, so my investment is definitely emotional and everything else. It doesn't hurt that some of the animals that I have in my collection are 4 figures worth of snake. That is definitely an investment that you want to consider too. If you're spending that much money on an animal and you're bringing a new one into your home, you might want to consider testing that new animal just so you don't lose out not only on that money, but on keeping a member of your family around for as long as you possibly can. That's my motivation in testing for these viruses. Something that you'll sometimes hear is that people don't want to test for the disease because they don't believe that it's actually going to cause a problem, or that the test isn't specific enough to only detect versions of Nitovirus that are going to cause severe disease. And this is not a good way to think about this. If you test and you find out an animal does carry this disease, you should have a lower chance of spreading this disease to something else. You'll know to keep that animal separate from other animals. You'll know to make sure that you're practicing good biosecurity and hygiene, that you're not pairing that animal to a snake that is not affected. Regardless if that's a non-zero number, you'll still be able to limit the amount that this disease is able to spread. If you have no idea if the animal that you're bringing in happens to have a disease like Nitovirus or ADV or any of these other diseases, I guarantee you are more likely to spread this disease to other animals. It's really basic to think about it that way. It's really obvious to understand that if you don't know, you will spread it. If you do know, you can attempt to avoid spreading it and reduce the amount that you spread it by. This is the goal of the test. Some people throw around the concept of destroying or euthanizing animals that have a single positive test, and that nobody does that. That's crazy. That's crazy. That is just a really bad talking point, and we're going to make an entire video just on that later. So for this specific example, we're going to use this snake that I've got. She's female. She is probably 1.6 kilograms right now. And she's getting pretty close to that 3rd year where she'll be able to breed. I know a lot of people out there are probably trying to do this by themselves. If you don't have somebody to work with you, this can go really badly. The most important thing is that the swab that you're using can't touch anything else. You don't want any sort of foreign matter on there that you think might affect your test results. So don't drop it on the counter where you might have bleached lately. Don't do anything like that because you are going to waste your money on a test that's not going to come back accurate at all. So if you can find a friend, absolutely do it with a friend. I'm using a bag. It gives her something to grip with her tail. Sometimes that makes them feel a little bit more secure. And of course, this is a ball python, so ball pythons are pretty easygoing. When we test these animals, the goal is to get their mouth open so that we can easily visualize and keep clear a path to get to the choana? I'm not sure how to say that. I've asked people how to say that and I get 10 different answers. I'm going to go with choana. While you're performing the test, you want to get the swab right in that it's just a little keyhole right in the top of their mouth. It's kind of obvious where it goes. And you'll want to move it around for 15 seconds. The goal is to collect as much material onto the swab from that area as possible. If you get the swab in their mouth or get spit on it from places that aren't, specifically that little keyhole, it's not really going to matter, but remember, we're trying to focus on trying to get as much material from that specific area as possible. This is the advice that we get from Fishhead Labs on how to maximize the way that we collect samples. As mentioned earlier, sample collection is extremely important to how accurate your test is going to be. You want to collect as much material as possible on that swab from specifically that area. So for the second part of this video, I went and found a friend to help me do this, and you can see how much easier this goes. I don't have to worry about the snake using her body or her tail to knock the popsicle stick or the sample or anything like that out of my hands. She doesn't really struggle too much, and it really just takes a little bit of gentle pressure to hold down that snake. Something that I didn't mention is that I find this much easier if you can turn the snake upside down. The reason for that is because you're looking to get that swab into the roof of their mouth. I guess you could hold them right side up and kind of crouch down, but that's way too awkward, and we want to make this as easy as possible so we can get it over quickly and let this snake go back to noodling around. So I would definitely find a friend, gentle pressure, and they should be just fine. If you try this with a short-tailed python, that poor person is going to get covered in vile short-tailed python fluids. So with the test done and the snake all secured away and comfy and happy and back to noodle-doodling around, we're going to take this swab and get it shipped off to Vet DNA. Depending on what you have access to, maybe your workplace will let you send stuff overnight, maybe not, maybe you'll get fired, don't blame me if that happens, but whatever you have access to, if you can get this shipped off overnight, I think one of the carriers that I use, it's $40 to ship and get it there before 10 a.m. I think it is. So that works out really well if you're testing multiple snakes. If you want to maximize the amount of value you get when you mail these, obviously put as many samples in the envelope as you can. That's one of the things that I enjoy about Vet DNA is that they're not specifically specialized to just snakes. If I wanted to do a test for Nitovirus or ADV on one of the bearded dragons that I have, I could do that, put that swab in the bag, and then go ahead and swab a snake for Nito, put that in the same bag, and ship them both off to Vet DNA for processing and get results back pretty fast. If you're considering trying this for the first time, I absolutely say that you should go get the Fishhead Labs kit. Fishhead Labs is very specific in doing Nitovirus testing only, and so their kit is going to include everything from the rubber gloves to the tongue depressor to instructions that show you exactly how to sample a snake. That kit will show up, it has its own return envelope. You'll be able to do pretty much the exact same thing that I did in this video, except the swab is a little bit different. It's got kind of a breakaway point. You'll get a little PCR vial inside of the envelope. You'll finish the test, put the swab inside of the PCR vial, and then cut that swab off or break it off or whatever, and then that's what you'll be sending back. I think both Brian Cusco and Garrett from Reach Out Reptiles used a Fishhead Labs test if you want to see what they do. There are other labs that can perform these tests, of course. If you go to your veterinarian, which, that is the obvious advice. If you believe that you have anything going on with one of your snakes, take it to the veterinarian. If you want to do a screening before you bring a snake into your collection, that is highly advised. And that goes for more than snakes. If you want to bring in a bearded dragon, if you want to bring in a reticulated python, if you want to bring in any of these animals, you'll want to take them to a veterinarian and make sure that you're not pulling any sort of disease into your collection. That could be anything from crypto to Nito to any of these things. So obviously, if you're very serious about this and you love your animals the way that I love my animals, you'll take them to the veterinarian for a checkup and diagnostic, and they'll be able to do this test for you. If you bring in a lot of animals, that obviously becomes a little bit price prohibitive, also time prohibitive and everything else, so you may consider doing them at home. You can do them at home with both Fishhead Labs and Vet DNA as mentioned. You can also use PALS UK if you're over in that area, and there is also a lab called Laboklin. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. It's Laboklin. That you can use that does many different tests for many different animals. Again, to maximize the value of getting those results shipped across, you'll want to pack as many samples into the envelope as possible. Hopefully I've demonstrated just how easy and accessible PCR testing for diseases in pet reptiles really is. For this, I used a ball python, one of the most popular pet snakes, and tested them for Nitovirus, one of the most pervasive diseases in one of the most popular pet snakes. It was simple to do. I definitely suggest having two people to do it. You can also, the methodology is almost the same if you wanted to test for something like ADV inside of a bearded dragon. Obviously not identical, but it's pretty much the same. If you need any instructions on how to do that, you can contact the lab that you're doing the testing with, and they'll tell you exactly how to do it. It's not something that's difficult, it's something that's been made accessible for a really fair price. $25 per sample is definitely something that I'd be willing to pay if I'm very serious about bringing snakes into my home at all. Some people might argue that this is too much, but I mean, 25 bucks per sample, if I wanted to do it 3 times, that's $75 to know that that animal's in good health. And if I wanted to throw in another test before breeding, like we're doing with the video here, then that pretty much rounds out to about $100, give or take some shipping. And I've got a pretty good guarantee that when I breed these snakes, I will have healthy snakes for a very long time. People out there are paying 5 figures for ball pythons, 4 figures for ball pythons, and I really don't think that it's really that much of an impact to have to pay a little bit extra to make sure these animals are healthy. When you order an animal from a breeder, you can ask them about Nitovirus. So far, I haven't really gotten a lot of great answers or any answers about pre-testing. Every now and again, I have had a breeder say that they will test the animal at their facility before shipping it, which is great. When I bring animals in, specifically ball pythons, and have them shipped through FedEx or Ship Your Reptiles or a service, right? Then I will take that animal and keep them in the box, test them for Nitovirus, ship that sample off before ever taking them out of the box. Yeah, they're in the box for another additional 24 hours, but I know that biosecurity keeps them away from the animals that I have in my home, and I know that biosecurity also protects them from the animals that I have in my home. If there's anything wrong with the purchase of this snake, then it's only fair to the breeder and, of course, to the buyer that you do some testing and make sure that you have a healthy animal and make sure to coordinate that you can get that animal returned if there's a problem. As a breeder, you might want to practice this as well. If you were to buy this specific snake from me, I would absolutely give you the records that I have of when she was tested for Nitovirus, when she was paired, and what the last results were. More than likely, in an upcoming video, we're going to talk specifically about Nitovirus and the impact it has, and some of the keepers that have actually opted to have snakes that are Nitovirus positive and with the presence of disease in their collections.